Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to start approaching Paul's Epistle to Romans in earnest. We're going to sort of take this thing line by line, verse by verse, after pretty much today. So today we're going to kind of look at the introductory remarks in the book of Romans and the overall outline and layout of the book as well. So we'll be following an outline that a scholar that wrote this commentary came up with, Paul J. Achtemeier. Apologize for any mispronunciation with the interpretation commentary in Romans. This is my favorite kind of one-stop shop on the book of Romans. There are several others I like that I'm very indebted to. I listened to a entire seminary course on the New Testament put on that's been on iTunes by Fuller Theological Seminary by the late David Scholler, who's a New Testament scholar. It's own podcast forms, but you can kind of tell it had been taped at the time. But he walks through lots of the life of Paul for me, turned me on to other books that I've been very indebted to as well. Among them, F. Bruce, who wrote a sort of scholarly biography of Paul called Paul, the Apostle of the Heart Set Free. And then I also recently have gone after Paul through NT Wright's biography of Paul. And I'll give links to any of those books that in case you're interested in them. So the outline for Paul for the book of Romans is fairly important. Unlike many books of the Bible, where the chapter headers make a certain amount of sense, or were kind of there in the original. So, for example, the Psalms, as they are separated, that's totally natural. Or like in the book of Job, where it's a conversation and the chapters always mark out a shift in the conversation. The book of Romans, when the chapters and verses were added in a few hundred years ago, way after it was written, made a lot of mistakes. It misses, it interrupts arguments in the flow of Paul, jumps in the middle of statements. They're fairly clumsy. So we're going to use this outline as a chapter. So your normal approach to reading the book of the Bible, a lot of people may have grown up with, read a chapter a night or something like that. But the book of Romans may actually lead you to some weird misconceptions because you're going to miss the argument and you're going to kind of miss what the point of the argument is by interrupting the reading of it through a night of sleep. A lot of things, if you drill down into the Greek, you have words like therefore that kind of set up the argument flow. And you can kind of tell, okay, this is kind of the next step that he's going to do. And so we're going to refer to these, and I'm going to be indebted to Mr. Achtemeier, or Dr. Achtemeier probably, for his work and sort of finding the flow of these arguments. I'm kind of convinced reading that he's more or less right in the outline. So that outline has been provided for you through a link on RimWeb and also through Teams. If you can Google up this outline for Romans and do it, I'll also be titling all the videos by the outline. So it'll be, with a spot on the outline with, capital, Roman numeral I, capital A, Arabic number 1, etc., so that you can kind of see it. So the videos by the end of this will kind of be the outline as well. So today we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 13, which are a little out of the flow because it's the introduction. It's the sort of greetings and all that. So like in the background, we kind of looked at the end. The beginning and the end are kind of a little bit outliers. But other than those, the Epistle of Romans follows basically a 4-part flow. So you kind of have in the first bit, part 1, you kind of have the problem. And it's sort of that it comes down to God's wrath falling equally upon Jews and Gentiles, which is going to be recurringly the flow that Jews and Gentiles, both, and therefore all humanity. Again and again and again, we'll see that rendering of Gentiles, Jews, Gentiles. It's kind of sing-songing your way through to make sure, hey, if that gets both of them, that gets everybody. So kind of almost the same way as saying men and women. Okay, that means everybody. So from chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 22, this is one of the more egregious kind of mischapterings. that follows that part, and it's sort of, you can look at it as a problem. And then chapter 4, starting in verse 23 through the end of chapter 8, after this, the chapter titles get a little better. You kind of have the solution, and a lot of times that's when we lose interest, particularly Protestants. That's where we get, okay, by faith, God has done this, and how it's God's gift and all that. But for Paul, it doesn't answer his argument. So it's sort of like step 1 is a problem, step 2 is the solution. But now he's like, so now what does that mean in the big picture for Jews and Gentiles? So, chapters 9 to 11 is actually for Paul the climax of his argument. It is going to be, what is God doing therefore right now? What is he doing with all those things we looked at in the background? What is it doing in the conflict between Jews and Gentiles? What does it mean for that God's promises to his people Israel don't seem to be being fulfilled? A lot of times we've looked at that as sort of like not our problem anymore, something dated or past. But for Paul, and we should respect the author here, this is the most critical part of the argument. This is what he's trying to figure out. And that gets us in chapter 11. And then after this massive, magnificent piece of art argument that goes from chapter 1 to 11, he's like, okay, so now what does this mean? And that's what we get from chapter 12 through the end. And that's where we're going to get a lot of our practical applied stuff, but it's also where Paul is going to take the insight God has clarified in his head to deal with the situation in Rome, but also to give general principles for everything. So that's going to be the general outline we're going to do. 4 big parts, more or less, chapters 1 through 4, then 5 through 8, then 9 through 11, and then 12 to the end. And so we'll be breaking into those as we go. I also encourage you to try to read as much as you can in context. So what I would recommend doing is between each video, read the previous video's passage and then read the next video's passage. And so you can hand off one to the other. So you'll have like a pre-critical reading before we talk about it. Then you hear us talk about it. Then you read it again, see it's all there, and then you read the next bit and then repeat. And I'd also encourage you periodically to read it like the original readers did. A lot of times when we think about like reading something in context, we read the verse above and the verse below. Look at Romans, it's an 11 chapter argument followed by application. One verse up and down doesn't do it. Yeah, reading it like it was originally read matters, which is kind of, it's a little brutal because it's his longest book. That's like reading the whole thing in a sitting. So I'd recommend periodically doing that if you want to kind of get to the point to get the full reward of sort of learning the ins and outs of this book. And this is a book you can't get done in one take. Every year I go through it, teaching it through my classes, and I learn new things every time. I'm looking forward to find out what I'm going to learn this time. So right now, I'd like you to take a chance to pause and then read chapter 1, verses 1 through 13. If you notice in a lot of translations, that's not where the chapter breaks, but I will show you in the next video why that's the break, why we don't flow into 14. So take a pause, read verses 1 through 13. And welcome back. So, Paul here is going to give a greetings. These are kind of standard for any sort of Greco-Roman letter of the time. The equivalent of a "to whom it may concern" or something along those lines. Following the format, but he does some interesting things in this. Now, this is where this level of Bible scholarship is above my pay grade. The reading tons of different Greco-Roman letters, looking how Paul is changing with the literary form of it, enlarging what's happening. There's a lot of interesting things he does there. They almost always ended up with like a prayer invoking gods, and here he's going to do stuff that undermines that. I don't quite have that down. That's some of the scholarship I'm most intimidated by, and I'm not going to go that into that, but only because I'm be utterly reliant on other people's work, and I don't know. I can't quite see what they're doing in it sometimes. There usually is like a little in the prayer. of any of Paul's letters. A lot of times people think, okay, the theme of the whole book is in there, and we'll see that a little bit in here. But the greetings are doing things like that. They are kind of creating Paul, and how he greets people is like invoking in the kingdom of God in a new realized way in everything he does. God's making all things new, including very mundane things like letter writing, which is really one of Paul's letters. You look at another letter from that time, you'll see this is not the same old thing. He's figured out a way to reinvent that, and that's kind of cool. So, so that's there. A few little interesting tidbits in the first bit. That'd be sort of pre verse 8. One, Paul, a servant of Christ, called to be apostle. That first line identifies Paul as the sole author. This is the only letter where Paul doesn't have like co-authors mentioned or all the brothers who are with me mentioned. So for the first, this Roman stands out as like, no, this is like just Paul making this case, and there might be reasons for that. Uh, as we see, this is addressed to Rome, and we see kind of in the concluding remarks what he's doing. He might be partly defending his apostolic mission that he is set apart for God for this call to reach Gentiles, and he doesn't want to burden that onto anybody else. He knows to some degree his ministry is under trial if he's going to come to Rome and ask for their support, and so he's not going to kind of like share the responsibility around. It also is like he knows as he goes to Jerusalem and faces possible trial that this needs to be his own work. It needs to be settled in his own head. So this is Paul at his sort of, in some ways, his most individual, but I mean, even as most individual, Paul just utterly adores the church, as we're going to see. So we don't want to go too far with that. We also see as we go further down in in verse 7, it says, to those in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints. We see the identification of the title, which is kind of obvious, but hey, sometimes that's missing in certain books. And so dressed in Rome, and Rome is throughout the book. There's no reason to doubt why this is going to Rome. Um, and then we kind of get to his actual talk. So let's look at verses 8 through 10, where we kind of get started into a little bit more meat, though not as much as in future videos. It says, first, I thank my God. I'm using the English Standard Version. Through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. So he's like, he's thankful for God. He knows that this Roman church that he had nothing to do with starting is kind of their faithfulness is proclaimed everywhere. They may have had a tough time too. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of the Son, that without ceasing I mention you, that he's always praying him, and God can witness it because he's the one who's talking to him. Always in my prayer, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you. And there we kind of get to the same thing he alludes to at the very end of the book, where you can see all that ties it all together, where Paul is longing to go to Rome, but hasn't been so far. But he's doing it the right way. He's not just like making plans and watching them fall through. He's praying to God, and God's Spirit's been preventing it. So we kind of see him modeling it, that he's been longing and longing, and he doesn't just sit on that. He brings that to God. So if you remember, why does he want to go to Rome? Well, partly it's sort of that end of the world. It's the capital. It's the disputes that we are anticipating maybe being in Rome that he may or may not know about. He may be anticipating disputes. He knows Jews and Gentiles fight in certain ways. So when Jewish Christians have returned to Rome, he might think, let's head this off before it happens, or he may have like specific things he's meddling in. He also wants to go to Spain. He also would like to have them send him forward. But he's going to here now he's going to give his reasons here so we can kind of see it. So in verses 11 through 13, it'll be kind of the end chunk of this. For a long to see, so he's going to tell you why, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. So one thing he wants to do is he wants to strengthen them with some spiritual gift. Something he wants God to use them to strengthen this church that he loves. He wants God to use him as a gift, which is something that we should all grow to want to have the way our life works. It's not his gift, it's God's gift, but he wants to be a means for that gift to go to them. And he clarifies what he means by spiritual gift to strengthen them, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. He would like to be encouraged by them as much as he'd like to encourage them. That basically they can grow together, that we see in the kingdom of God. It's not a zero-sum game, it's a win-win. He's not just going to give and lose. They're going to be encouraged by each other's presence. And we'll see. I do not want you to be unaware that I have often tended to come to you, but that's where I've been prevented. And we saw that, talked about it in the background stuff that comes at the end. In order that I might reap some harvest among you. He says he doesn't want to reap or sow, but Paul's Paul. He wants people harvesting no matter how it happens. Among them, as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. And that last word, Gentiles, the nations, this is going to be Paul's mission going forward. And the next video is going to cover, like, why is he so passionate about the Gentiles? And he's going to kind of give a comprehensive defense of what he's been doing. So that is going to be our springboard. And so this will be our conclusion. And so I will see you in the next video.